Welcome back, everybody. Today's video is all about aperture priority and manual mode. This lesson is part 3 of basic camera settings, and you can download this PowerPoint and other presentations as well by going to my TPT store, and those links will be listed in the description found below. Let's go ahead and finish up the final presentation to camera settings. Now, each camera is slightly different, but we have been talking about the main functions that most DSLR or mirrorless cameras should have. There are other functions, of course, but they're usually camera dependent, so we're going to talk about some of those briefly at the end of this presentation, but for now, let's finish talking about camera modes. So before we move on, what are some reasons why you would want to learn more about camera modes? Well, understanding each mode and what function it provides will highly improve the quality of your work. You can also use your camera's settings to regulate the exposure in your scene. Also, it is a good idea to have other tools to which you can create a wide array of visual effects. Do you know how to create blurred motion or blurry backgrounds? Do you know how to create depth of field in your photos and videos? Now, you will also need to know how to manipulate your camera settings in order to optimize your exposure and brightness. So we've been covering the main camera modes: program mode, shutter speed priority, aperture priority, manual mode. We already talked about the first two modes in the previous lessons, so let's go ahead and focus on aperture and manual mode today. So right now, go ahead and spin your camera dial to A and let's talk about that. So what is aperture priority? Well, aperture priority is the mode that puts you in control of adjusting the aperture size. After you select the desired f-stop number, the camera will then choose what shutter speed it thinks is best suited for the scene you're shooting at the time. So why would you want to use this mode? Well, there are two main reasons that we're going to talk about today. One is exposure and brightness, and two is depth of field and background blur. You want to understand aperture and f-stop more because aperture priority is a mode that a lot of pro photographers like to use a lot. Before we get into why you want to use aperture priority, let's go ahead and talk about f-stop numbers first. So what is f-stop exactly? Well, an f-stop number indicates the size of the opening of your aperture, and your aperture is what controls the quantity of light that passes through your camera's lens. And so the f-stop number actually represents a mathematical equation where the focal length is divided by the iris's diameter, and f-stop numbers can become confusing because the larger your f-stop number is, the smaller the aperture's opening will be. But yet, the smaller your f-stop number is, the larger that aperture opening will be. Now, the reason why numbers indicate small is big and big is small is because the denominator of the fraction is the number that's being affected. And if you know your math, then the bigger the denominator gets, the smaller the fraction will become. So here's some more math. The reason f-stop numbers have decimals is because each stop is an exponent of the square root of 2. Now, we're going to skip all of this for now, but that's why f-stop numbers have decimals, and that's why the numbers shrink as the size increases. Adjusting your f-stop number too low or too high can cause problems. For instance, too low of an f-stop number can cause vignetting in your photos, and it all depends on your lens. But if you crank up your f-stop number too high on the wrong lens, it can cause other issues like diffraction and chromatic aberration as well. Now, all of these things can be managed in post-processing, but the goal is to try and get it right in camera first before you even take your files into Lightroom or Photoshop. Nonetheless, these are minor details that would probably go unnoticed, but not every lens has an f-stop number to adjust. Some lenses have electronic communication with the camera, whereas other lenses don't. Now, prime lenses are a good example because my prime lens forces me to not only move around to get the ideal angle and focal length, but it also forces me to manually adjust my f-stop number. And not only has this lens forced me to gain more experience, it has also given me the confidence to use it more often in the field. Now, some cameras only have one aperture size, which is what we call a fixed aperture. For example, smartphones typically have a fixed aperture of about f2.0 to about f2.4. So since we're talking about cameras and their aperture size, what's your camera's capabilities? What's your lens's maximum aperture size? What's your camera's minimum and maximum shutter speed? And what about your minimum and maximum ISO? Knowing the limitations of your gear will not only improve the quality of your work, but it will also give you an idea of what type of camera gear you want to add to your kit in the future. I suggest that you investigate prime lenses, especially ones with lower f-stop numbers like, let's say, 1.8. These lenses are good and they're relatively cheap, and again, they really help you become a better photographer because you're forced to make manual adjustments. Alright, so let's talk about using your aperture to adjust the exposure in your scene. Remember, light determines the exposure, so if you can manipulate your light source too, you're going to produce much better results. I created a lesson that's all about lighting, and so if you want to check that video out, I have listed a link in the description below. But back to exposure triangle. We have learned so far that ISO, shutter speed, and aperture all manipulate light as it passes through your camera lens and enters your camera sensor. But let's talk about aperture specifically. Don't forget that adjusting any one side of the exposure triangle will affect at least one other side as well. and that you'll have to adjust the triangle until you optimize the brightness in your scene. But when you're in aperture priority mode, your camera will make all those choices for you, which allows you to focus more on adjusting your aperture. The aperture controls the amount of light that passes through your camera lens, and it gives you more control over the depth of field in your photos. For example, when you increase the size of your aperture, you are increasing the quantity of light that enters your camera sensor. However, when you increase your aperture, you are also decreasing the amount of depth that your photos and videos will contain. Although having a shallow depth of field is largely sought after by creatives, though sometimes you need more depth in your photo to either help tell the story or bring your subjects into focus. If you are beginning in photography or videography, I highly suggest that you study the exposure triangle and implement it when you're in the field. Practice it enough and it will become second nature to you, and when you're out there in the field, you won't be thinking about no triangle. So I've mentioned depth of field there a few times, and we've talked about depth before in the Rules of Composition Part 2 video, which is also linked in the description below. However, what is depth of field exactly? Depth is the distance that's between your camera lens and the farthest point in the background. But it doesn't have to be completely exaggerated like that, because depth perception can be just a couple feet in front of you. However, looking at a photo, how can you tell the distance between objects? In some situations, like mountains, we just know. But even mountains off in the distance have some type of depth perception going on. We don't cognitively pick up on it, we just see it as normal. And so depth of field determines the focus though, which is either going to be sharp or blurry. Shallow depth of field produces blurry backgrounds, whereas deeper depth of field produces sharper backgrounds. So, do you want your background to be in focus, or do you want it to be blurry? I know that some of you are shooting on a cell phone, so don't forget that you can add depth to your photos and videos without adjusting your aperture by incorporating something called frames. Be sure to check out my Rules of Composition Part 2 video for more information on that. So since we're talking about background blur, let's go ahead and talk about bokeh. Technically, bokeh is background blur, but bokeh is simply just the out of focus blur in the background of photos and videos. So here's some quick tips on how you can create bokeh in your work. You can adjust your f-stop number to the widest aperture, you can create space between your subject and the background, and you can also zoom in and focus on your subject. Doing any one of these things will increase the amount of bokeh in your photos and videos. However, combine these techniques together and it will intensify those results. Try creating bokeh with lights such as Christmas lights or street lights, and to get this effect, blur up the background, do it at night, and use some other type of light source in the background of your frame. So if you're going to take full control of your camera, you should also learn how to read histograms. This is because when you're out shooting in the field, you can't trust your LCD screen. Sometimes it's too bright to tell, plus the quality of the footage is not very visible. This is where histograms come in handy and can save you from having to come back and do retakes. Now, histograms are just bar graphs and they represent a specific range of data, and you can use this diagram to help you interpret histogram. So looking at the diagram, going from left to right, you have blacks, shadows, midtones, highlights, and whites. We're just going to briefly introduce histograms and how to help you get started reading them, but for now, a general rule to follow is to try to make sure that there is data throughout the entire histogram. So by looking at histogram number 2, you can see that the graph has place values throughout the entire graph. It has shadows, midtones, highlights, it's all there. However, in histogram number 1, you can see that there is some missing data, more specifically the blacks and the whites. So in any situation, keeping exposure in mind of course, you want to shoot to the right of the histogram. This is because that's where your brightness is determined. Now, if you're shooting in RAW, you can recover a lot of that missing data, but if you're shooting in JPEG, you're going to need to get your exposure correct in camera the best you can. So I just mentioned some file formats, more specifically RAW files versus JPEG files. Now, RAW files have more data than JPEGs do, and so that also means that RAW files require more memory. RAW files require more memory because they contain a lot more data. This means that RAW photos will have more details, much more higher than JPEGs will, and photographers can post-manipulate their tones and colors much easier when shooting in RAW. And honestly, I think it's worth the extra memory because you can save photos that would otherwise be considered trash, especially if they're over or underexposed. For instance, you can take a photo that looks something like this, and then, just with a few clicks, you can make it look like this. So if you've made it this far, and you are genuinely interested in histograms and shooting in RAW, then you're probably going to want to eventually work your way into manual mode. So take what you've learned about aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, and take control of your camera. All you need is a bit of practice. While in manual mode, you can still set your ISO to auto if that's something you want to do. Just remember that low f-stop numbers have sharper images, slower shutter speeds have sharper images, and lower ISOs have less noise. It is up to you as the photographer to balance your settings while in manual mode to optimize your sharpness and your brightness. And if that sounds like a lot to you, then you might be asking, why would you want to use this? Well, I thought of 3 ways that you should attempt manual mode, especially as a beginner, because it's a great way to help you learn faster, it gives you more control over your camera, and it gives you more creative freedom as an artist. So I've been mentioning that we would talk about other camera modes, and well, these functions are not always available on every camera. Sometimes it depends on the brand, but most of the time it depends on the price. I picked out just a few because there are many, but these are some that I think you'll encounter yourself, and you'll probably want to test these out as a content creator. Night vision and thermal imaging, these both allow you to see at night, but they do so in different ways, and some cameras have these functions and others don't. So if this is something that you're interested in, or any other of these functions for that matter, then you should probably investigate what cameras have which specific functions that you want as a creator. Creative filters. So my Canon M50 has creative filters such as a miniature effect and HDR effects. It also has a grainy black and white effects. Slow motion is another option, and my Canon M50 also has a high frame rate option, but the issue there is my camera only records high frame rates at 720. My GoPro, however, it can film 240 frames per second while shooting at 1080, or 120 frames per second while shooting at 2.7K. My GoPro also has a built-in image stabilizer. It's called a Hyper Smooth Boost, and it stabilizes footage pretty good for an action camera. But what does your camera or cell phone have in terms of modes and functions? So I challenge each of you to spend more time going through your settings and what kind of features it has, and then research what type of gear goes along with your device as well. Because technology, it's making things pretty easy for us content creators. Alright, so we covered the basics of camera settings, we introduced each camera mode, we explained the difference between P mode and M mode, and why you should use one over the other. We also talked more about shutter speed and aperture priority, as well as ISO, and we described each function in relationship to brightness and visual effects. We talked about how using these functions allows you as the artist to create striking visuals with techniques such as depth of field, motion blur, background blur, as well as making sure that your scene is properly exposed using the exposure triangle. We talked about other camera settings too, which really just points out that you do need to become familiar with your own camera, because a lot of those settings are camera specific. I suggest that you get out there and test your limitations, practice what is more challenging to you, because remember, you want to gain as much experience as possible, and the best way to do that is to practice. Now these 3 lessons on basic camera settings were geared towards helping you understand your camera, and so it's important to understand each function and how to make adjustments to specific shooting conditions or other problematic situations. Once you understand how to control your camera, the quality of your artwork is going to increase significantly. If you're feeling generous today, do consider hitting the like and subscribe button. Tap on the notification bell to be notified when I upload new videos, and you can share to anybody who's willing to learn, colleagues, students, friends, and family. Hope y'all have a great week, and I'll see y'all in the next one.